Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We're reporting this week from the 2016 Goodmanson Sandhills Lab Open House near Whitman, Nebraska. Spread across 3 counties in the west central area of the state, the cow herd here roams nearly 12,000 acres of rangeland and 1,200 acres of sub-irrigated and wetland meadows. On this episode, Jessica Sampson discusses cattle prices, Tamra Jackson-Ziems describes a bacterial corn disease, Jerry Volseky talks about pasture and range conditions, Chuck Burr explains how irrigators can test pressure regulators, and Chuck Hibbard previews the Raising Nebraska exhibit at this year's Nebraska State Fair. Jessica Sampson from the Livestock Marketing Information Center is our cattle market analyst this week. The August 1st inventory of U.S. cattle and calves on feed totaled 10.2 million head, up 2% from a year ago. Placements were also 2% higher. The USDA's cattle on feed report released last Friday showed a different trend for Nebraska. This state's inventory was down 5%, while placements were down 10%. In the grocery store, consumers have had the chance to buy the cheapest beef in months. The average cost for all fresh retail beef averaged $5.75 per pound in July, the lowest price since January. We talked with Jessica here Wednesday morning and began by looking at recent price movements in live and feeder cattle markets.
So in August, obviously across the industry, we saw a collapse in cattle prices. A lot of factors built up to that. Mainly, we were just backing up fat cattle, we were backing up feeder cattle, and they all came to the market, and the market didn't handle it quite as well. Since then, we've come up from those lows, but definitely lower than the beginning of 2015. So we've been tracking lower, we've been tracking more of our seasonally normal, historically normal price levels. If you think 2010 to 2011, 12, kind of around there. We're actually really seeing pretty similar prices 2012 and 2013. So in terms of price levels, 15, 20% lower than a year ago. A year ago was still record highs up until August. Moving into fourth quarter, we do not expect a similar price collapse as we saw last year. We've been much more current on fat cattle marketings, which pulls in more feeder cattle, much more current on those as well. So we don't expect to see another collapse in the market in fourth quarter.
Let's talk about the cattle on feed report. We saw U.S. placements and inventory that were up 2% each, but Nebraska was way below that. Why is that?
Right, and that was definitely a difference in the trend, especially for Nebraska. Looking at most recent months, we've seen higher placements in Nebraska. We've seen a transition of cattle on feed in Nebraska because that's where we're growing more corn. So this was different, and I didn't see any obvious immediate reasons for it. Some of the reasons I was wondering is if we see better pasture conditions in Nebraska right now than kind of the southern plains, if we think about Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas. So maybe there's still some more calves and yearlings out there out on grass waiting for this market price to come up slightly into the fourth quarter. I think that could be one of the bigger reasons.
How do you think cull cow numbers for slaughtering will change, and what could that be an indicator of?
Sure, and that's a really good question, an important number we look at to indicate what herd inventory is doing. So if we look at year-to-date cow slaughter, beef cow slaughter, we're up about 10% compared to last year. That's a pretty normal change that we were expecting this year, and right now it still just indicates a slowdown in herd growth, not a reversal. So we're not seeing people reducing their herd size. When you keep a cow an additional year or two, you don't have that many extra years you can keep her. So this is why we expected to see this increase in slaughter cows. And we're moving into the fall months here, and we'll continue to see that increase. That's when the majority of your cows go to the marketplace. But it's not a huge number by any means yet. And same with heifer slaughter. Year to date, we've actually are about 1% below last year's in terms of number of head. But we have started to see more heifers show up at the packer, these last couple weeks, and we'd expect that to continue, but not huge increases relative to last year. So slow down in herd growth, but not a reversal.
How do you think beef consumption has held up here as we approach the end of grilling season?
Well, beef consumption's doing well, and a lot of times we'll confuse consumption with demand. So consumption is purely just the supply available per person in the U.S. So if we factor in price into that as well, and we talk about beef demand, if we think about our big holiday months so far this year, Memorial Day, 4th of July, we're working into Labor Day, we saw an uptick in essentially throughput of beef from the grocery store to the consumer, but it wasn't quite as exciting as we were hoping for it to be. So based on our demand index that we calculate, demand slowed down some this year, but not drastically at all. We're talking about slight changes, slight decreases. The price of beef at the grocery store has come down, so that's great news for the consumer. Now we're just waiting for that volume movement to match up with this price decrease. So, we haven't seen quite as good a movement, but I think that there's a lot of potential for that to improve into this year and into 2017. Can
you describe how the packer has done during that time?
Yes. We don't have really hard numbers on these packer margins, so what we do to look at that is we take the difference of the live animal, that fed steer price, and compare it to the cutout price, so what the packer buys versus what the packer sells. Obviously, this isn't including any labor costs, energy costs, overhead, anything like that. But the packers had a very good year. They've been above year ago on that margin all year so far. And what that really comes down to is the price of the fed steers come down more so than the cutout prices come down. And that cutout price translates to the retail price. We've seen those retail prices come down compared to their highs of last year, but not quite as much as kind of the wholesale or the live animal prices have come down. So packers are doing well in terms of the numbers that we can see. And good news for them, but we'll see if it trickles through.
Yeah, how well are producers doing?
Right, so definitely not as well. I mean, we're cow-calf guys, there's still money to be made. If we look at our estimated average returns to cow-calf operations, if you include pasture rent, we're still looking at about $100 a cow on those returns. Obviously significantly lower than the $500 a cow seen a couple years ago, and that's hard to come down from, but more to historically normal levels for those returns. So there's still money to be made. But these lower prices have hit the live animal side, the cow-calf stockers, feedlots, much harder than they've hit the packer.
You see eroding prices through 2018. Tell me why.
The cyclically eroding prices comes with the increase in the cattle inventory. We saw pretty significant increases starting 2014, really saw them in 2015. We expect to continue to see inventory increases in 2016 and 17, but not as large. And that just lends itself to cyclically lower prices. Increase in supply, lower prices on the market, and we expect that through 2018 right now.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says Nebraska corn farmers have observed an unfamiliar disease in several areas of the state. We recently talked with Tamra to learn more about scouting, identifying, and managing the disease.
This disease is a bacterial disease that we've been watching for over a couple of years now, and the name of the disease is Bacterial Leaf Streak, and it's caused by a species of the bacterium that is Xanthomonas vesiculopathovar vasculorum. And this particular species, in addition to infecting corn, is also known to cause an important disease called gumming disease in sugarcane and other parts of the world.
What are its distinguishing characteristics?
Well, this particular disease is one that is causing some lesions on the plant leaves that people are noticing. Often they start in the lower leaves and they're between the veins. And so it looks a lot like some of the other common diseases that we've been seeing and is being frequently misdiagnosed. And we want to make sure that people are aware of it.
How do you distinguish this disease from perhaps other diseases in corn?
Well, this bacterial disease does cause lesions that are very narrow and sometimes like a stripe between the veins. Well, that can look very similar to things like gray leaf spot that's caused by a fungus. But one thing that we emphasize is that gray leaf spot lesions tend to have very rectangular shapes with smooth linear margins. While in contrast, this bacterial disease very commonly has wavy margins. And so if you look very closely, you should be able to see that the edges of these lesions may look a little bit different. And you might want to look at quite a few lesions and leaf samples to really get a handle on that symptom. These lesions can be brown to tan and often yellow. And so if you hold those leaves up to the sun and backlight it, for example, you'll see the yellow coloration very obviously, and that's another way that we can differentiate it from other things like gray leaf spot.
Where has this disease been located?
Well, we've confirmed this disease in several counties in Nebraska and some of our neighboring states as well. And so we're watching this disease closely and trying to better understand it and to conduct more research on it.
And what's been the impact?
We don't have specific research on what the yield impacts are, and so I'll tell you though, in most of the fields where I've seen it, it's been more of a cosmetic issue, an oddity. And so where you may have more of the disease, we may see more or less impact, but right now we really don't fully understand that.
Has treatment been effective?
Foliar fungicides are not expected to stop this bacterial disease. Although there are some bactericides that are labeled for use on corn, there are some limitations that they have that might make them impractical. For example, some of the common effective bactericides may contain copper. Well, those products are not systemic, and so they will remain on the surface of leaves and be washed off by rainfall or irrigation, and they may require repeated applications, and that might make them uneconomical.
What's the recommendation to the farmer that might be concerned about this disease then, Tamra?
Well, if they have this disease, I'll tell you that we don't have specific research yet on controlling this exact disease, but we recommend some of the general management practices that we have for other bacterial diseases like it. And so, for example, we know that this disease, this pathogen, is overwintering in infected crop debris from previous years, and so you are likely to see that disease developing in the same fields and areas year after year, like we did with Goss's wilt. So we also recommend crop rotation as a way to give that infected debris time to break down. And if people are still using tillage in their cropping system, that might be a way to help promote degradation. Although I'll caution that neither of these methods are expected to cause or give you complete control. It won't eliminate the risk of disease, it will just reduce severity in future years.
What does the grower do if he or she finds a disease that they're unfamiliar with?
If they're having trouble making a diagnosis, they have a lot of resources available to them, and especially the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. So we recommend putting that sample in a plastic bag and submitting it for analysis at the clinic to make sure that they know what it is before they make any treatment decisions.
You can find more about this disease in a recent article from Tamra. We'll link to that on the Market Journal website. The USDA's latest crop progress report lists 67% of Nebraska's pastures and ranges in good to excellent condition. That's down 2% from a week ago, but on par with this point in 2015. At the Goodmanson Sandhills Lab Open House here Wednesday, we talked with Nebraska Extension Range and Forage Specialist Jerry Volseky to get an update on forages and grasses in this part of Nebraska.
Well, here in kind of the west center Sandhills, I think things look really good in terms of the distribution of rainfall that we've had this past summer, as well as the amount. It's been very good. There are some parts of Nebraska, as we go to the more northwest, where drought is the word they're using, so it's quite dry there. And then also a bit of an area in south central Nebraska. Some of the pastures I've seen in that area don't look too good, really showing the effects of some dry conditions.
Your presentation today was on grazing systems research. Give me an overview for people that weren't here.
In our research, this is some longer term research that we've been doing with grazing systems, and basically we were comparing 3 different systems, and they each have different lengths of period of grazing in a pasture. So one of the treatments is a common continuous, season-long continuous. Oftentimes you're in the same pasture for 150 days or more. Another more simple rotation, comparable to a 4-pasture rotation. You might only spend roughly 40 days in each of the 4 pastures. Then we also included a management intensive type of grazing system treatment where the occupation or the time in a pasture is only 3 days. And so obviously with that type of situation or system, you have a lot of pastures that you rotate through very quickly. And some of the things we've seen with that work is that as you get into the rotation systems, it does make a marked difference in the distribution of grazing across the pasture. So it really does increase your efficiency compared to that continuous one where obviously you have areas that are pretty heavily grazed by the end of the year. Then you might even have some areas in that pastures that are not grazed at all. So definite advantages to these rotation types of systems.
Right, is that a recommendation, or are you to the point of making a recommendation or telling producers to think one way or the other?
Oh, absolutely, and we've done that in terms of some of our recommendations and suggestions for a number of years now, but with this work we're able to put some hard data, good data with it to really show the difference that some of these different management systems can make.
And what part of the state did you conduct this research?
This was a Sandhills type of research on native Sandhills range, yeah.
Describe what stocking rates you were working with in that research.
In that research, we did have two different levels of stocking rate. One was, we called it moderate, or the recommended stocking rate for that type of rangeland, and then we bumped it up to 1.5 times that, or we call it the heavy stocking rate. It was pretty interesting to see in terms of that heavy stocking rate. Most of the factors or variables we were looking at, they held up pretty well the first 4 or 5 years, but then it was like we almost hit a threshold in terms of what that heavy stocking rate effect was on the plant community. And certainly after the 5th year, started to see some big significant changes that we were grazing it too hard. And so we started to have a lowering of the range condition. Some of our desirable species were starting to disappear, and typical weedy type of things were starting to show up. So with that stocking rate, yes, a person may be able to get away with a little bit heavy stocking rate for a few years, but it is cumulative and it will catch up with you.
You can find more information about managing forages, pastures, and ranges on UNL's beef website. We'll link to those resources on the Market Journal homepage. Crop growers will have the opportunity to get a checkup on pressure regulators from their irrigation systems at this year's Husker Harvest Days. Nebraska Extension's Chuck Burr is part of a group of educators who will be testing those devices for free at the event. He explains how regulators work and why producers might be interested in bringing them along to Husker Harvest Days.
A pressure regulator is something that a lot of irrigators don't think about. It gets put on the irrigation system with the sprinklers, and as long as there's not water spraying everywhere, they assume it's working correctly. So we'd encourage producers to bring a couple regulators in for each span of their pivot. So if they have a 7-tower pivot, bring us about 14 or 15 regulators in. We'll test them to make sure the regulator's still working correctly, and if it is, that should ensure that they're doing a good uniform job of applying irrigation water. So a couple things can happen to the regulators. There's a kind of a rubber diaphragm in there, and that can rupture over time, and it'll start spraying water out the side of the regulator. If you're not looking closely, you might think that's water coming out of the sprinkler and just adding to the pattern. The other thing that can get bad with the regulator is a spring in there. And what happens, it gets old and weak, and it's not reducing the pressure like it should be. So the pressure on your irrigation system actually drops, and the flow rate actually increases because of these regulators failing. Then if you've got any hilly terrain at all up on the hill, you're not going to get enough pressure up there to apply water, so you're going to put on less, a lot more water applied down in the lower areas. So we start getting differences in the amount of water we apply. You make several circles with that difference, you start seeing differences in yield.
Husker Harvest Days take place September 13th, 14th, and 15th near Grand Island, Nebraska. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln building is located on 3rd Street. The August Nebraska farmer says just more than a year ago, Monsanto reopened the doors to its updated Wheat Technology Center in Idaho. This month's issue says the new center follows a pattern of expanding wheat breeding programs around the globe, including facilities on the plains and in the Pacific Northwest. You can read more about the center and some recent advances in wheat breeding in the August Nebraska Farmer. The 147th Nebraska State Fair begins Friday, August 26th in Grand Island and runs through September 5th. As you've seen previously on Market Journal, a major display at the fair is the Raising Nebraska exhibit. The 25,000 square foot space aims to connect with consumers and teach them more about where their food comes from and how it's raised. Nebraska Extension Dean and Director Chuck Hibbard has discussed the Raising Nebraska exhibit before on Market Journal. We spoke with him again this week to learn more about new additions to the display for this year and to learn more about its purpose.
Consumers in some cases are confused or have questions about where their food comes from, how it's produced, the cultural conditions, all those kinds of things. So Raising Nebraska was really an opportunity to provide an educational experience for consumers. And what was really different about this is it wasn't just us telling our story. We tried to frame everything in that exhibit around the way consumers would respond, the way consumers would react, give them lots of choices, lots of opportunities to learn things, and then to respond and react to those things. So that's why it's different than most exhibits like this.
A few years in now, what do you feel like that reaction has been like?
You know, it's been very, very positive. One of the things that we do that has really been effective is we have these trusted voice videos, and people can come in and they can choose whatever video. There's about 20 different ones that they can look at. They can choose the ones that they're interested in. The number 2 most popular video, because we can track this, is Sally McKenzie's video on GMOs. But the number 1 video, and this is the one that I think just kind of tells the story, the number 1 video was titled, "Do Cows Mind Being Milked?" Right? So our consumers are thinking about questions. They have questions in different ways than we would normally think about framing those questions, and Raising Nebraska has helped us respond to those.
What's new this year?
You know, 2 things that we're really excited about. Nebraska Environmental Trust has funded a project to help us create a learning experience around soil. And, you know, people, I think, take soil for granted, right? We walk on it, you know, it blows around every once in a while. They call it dirt. It's not dirt, it's soil. Soil is a living organism. It's full of microbes and earthworms and all kinds of stuff. And so this exhibit really helps people understand soil, the diverse soils in Nebraska. We have something like 60 different soil types in Nebraska. So that's a big one. We're excited about that one, and you'll see a lot more on that exhibit at the State Fair. The other one that's new that's really fun and exciting is we have a quiz game about GMOs. And so 4 people can compete against each other and learn about GMOs, learn about all the different GMOs that are in our food supply, some ones they haven't thought about, didn't know about, and ones that really focused on improving human health, which we think is also important.
What do you think the biggest misconception is about GMOs between consumers and producers?
Yeah, you know, GMOs are so important on the production side. The herbicide-tolerant crops that we raise have allowed us to greatly reduce the amount of pesticides that we apply, so we have a safer production system because of GMOs. And then some of the new GMOs that are more focused on human health, that's more the consumer side. So the golden rice, for example, where we add vitamin, you know, we increase the amount of vitamin A in the rice. It's a healthier product for people. So those are some of the things that we're trying to help people understand.
And finally, can you just explain the industry response and partnership that you found through this whole process of building the Raising Nebraska exhibit?
So it's really been fun to get the industry involved in this. Certainly the trusted voice videos, a lot of those came from people who represent agriculture in Nebraska. We also staff this Raising Nebraska exhibit during the State Fair with volunteers from the industry. So farmers come in, we've got a conversation pit, they can talk to people, talk about how they raise their crops, raise their animals, that sort of thing. And then a lot of the different stages that we have in the place, like our demonstration kitchen, for example, we have the commodity groups come in and they're doing different demonstrations of cooking and different kinds of things that they're doing with Nebraska agricultural products. So our industry is all behind this. They're very excited about this. You know, when we talk with our commodity boards, they tell us the number 1 thing we got to focus on is helping consumers understand their food.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, we dealt with off and again, on again thunderstorm activity, primarily over extreme eastern Nebraska, southeast Nebraska, and south central Nebraska. As you headed west and northwest, of course, the precipitation dropped off, and many locations did not receive any significant moisture during this last week. And so that we have seen some changes in the drought monitor, and I want to bring you up to date on that. So if we go to the drought monitor, what we're going to notice is that here in Nebraska, we're starting to see the elimination of some of the abnormally dry conditions that were painted for southeast Nebraska. And that's a reflection of the last 30 days to the 45-day period where we've been normal to slightly above normal for most of the region. There is still some drying in the 90-day out period, meaning that we're still picking up some of that residual dryness from early parts of June, late May in southeast Nebraska. So if we turn dry, don't be surprised if we see abnormally dry conditions reemerge. but as long as the precipitation remains normal to slightly above normal, we should not have to worry about a further increase in the abnormal dry areas. South central Nebraska, we have seen some slight improvements in this region, as some of that severe thunderstorm activity that developed along the frontal boundary did lay out some 1 to 2 inch totals and did take off some of the eastern extent of the dryness areas. And then, of course, in the Panhandle, we've seen the western extent of the moderate drought conditions in the northern Panhandle be reduced to abnormally dry conditions, but the consensus is there hasn't been widespread enough precipitation events to broad base this area back toward abnormally dry to normal conditions. A couple major precipitation events, and we'll see this region quickly dry back up into a paint of what we call white or normal conditions. So in terms of what we expect to see over this next 7-day period, of course, we have a trough moving through the region right now, dropping precipitation across eastern Nebraska, and this looks to be the focal point of precipitation for the next 24 hours, basically Grand Island eastward, and then we will start to see this trough pivot toward the Great Lakes region, and we'll see a ridging pattern start to develop in its wake. We will still see some residual moisture across southeast Nebraska, and until we do still see the opportunity for some precipitation, although very light, as we go into tomorrow, but more importantly, as we go into Monday, we will start to see a little bit of monsoon moisture in the lower atmosphere starting to move into the southeastern part of the state, and some weak energy in the mid layers of the atmosphere that may generate some thunderstorm activity across east central and southeast Nebraska. Further west you go, the less likely you are to see any precipitation. Now, as we get into Tuesday, we still see another slug of energy coming in across northern Kansas, western Kansas, and southern Nebraska. Once again, we have the opportunity to generate some precipitation, but it doesn't look to be widespread because we have no triggering mechanism, meaning a front in the area to really develop some widespread precipitation. Now, as we go into Wednesday, we'll see that moisture still resides in our region, although most of it will probably exit the region as we get to the first half of Wednesday. So there's still going to be a chance for scattered thunderstorm activity. As we go into Thursday, we start to see ridging taking place in the region, and we will see a return to drier weather, and that will continue into Friday. Now, if we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we are looking at above normal temperatures in response to high pressure in our region and drier than normal conditions, which do continue all the way through the first full week of September.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, a bacterial corn disease, range and pasture conditions, testing pressure regulators, and the Raising Nebraska exhibit at this year's Nebraska State Fair. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Jeff Peterson will be our corn and soybean market analyst, and Rorik Pullman will explain how water efficiency tools might help on your operation. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.